All right. Thank you, Megan. Welcome everybody who's attending, and hopefully we get a few more folks to come on late and watch the video afterwards. We're excited to have some really good speakers here this morning or this afternoon to help continue in our kind of educational series here of understanding the problem of home ownership amongst particularly the Black and Brown communities of America. We have, and I'll give a kind of formal introduction later, but we have Dr. Jeff Wright, Reverend Dr. Jeff Wright, who will be speaking on the wealth gap, and I'll give a formal introduction on him later. And then our own Audley Lewis, from loan officer from Hampton Roads, will be speaking as well, along with Sarah and myself. I just want to remind everyone of the mission of Wider Path. Our mission is to bring the housing industry together to support and sustain affordable housing through housing education, community development, and down payment assistance. We are here to help communities in need to access affordable home ownership. We want to provide all of our customers an experience of unearned grace, mercy, forgiveness, reconciliation, home rest, and unconditional love. Just our vision, we are a foundation who is dedicated to the teachings of Jesus Christ. And we are here to devoted to loving our neighbors, seeing the good of others, and to advocating for those who are in need. And we really want to continue just to grow our knowledge base here, particularly right now at Embrace, and obviously to help bring industry partners together. I'm fortunate enough to be able to sit on different panels and to be in relationship with the larger mortgage industry. I was able to actually have a phone call, and I'm hoping we're going to further have dialogue with another mortgage company who has a like-minded vision to us. I was fortunate enough to sit at the Mortgage Bankers Association conference a couple weeks ago, and got to have a lot of conversations with large industry banks about what we're doing, and there's a lot of interest. And so I think we're helping to kind of hopefully forge a path and to have these discussions and to hopefully grow the industry and wanting to do the right things, and to see that it is not just mutually exclusive to just to do right things, but we can do right things and we can do it and make a profit that we can put back into the communities that we serve in. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, and I know she's got a lot that she wants to share this morning, and so take it away, Sarah.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. If you were with us at the first launching of Wider Path Home Foundation back in October, you got to meet both Dennis and Brian and myself, and got to hear from Ben Giamara and Tom Pinkowish, who did a really wonderful job capturing the story of redlining in our country and how that worked in Black and Brown communities in particular, but how that's impacted the housing industry and financial sectors. And we're building on that momentum from that first event. And today we have the opportunity to learn from Jeff Wright, who is just a phenomenal community development, passionate advocate in many communities across our country through his publishing company and through his community development work and partnerships. And we'll have an opportunity to learn some of the history of how people have been mobilizing in the midst of this redlining and in the midst of racial restrictive covenants and in the midst of urban renewal practices and eminent domain and all of these forces that have happened and carried through the housing industry that have set inequalities in a trajectory that has ensured that certain resources land in the hands of predominantly white populations, and that other resources are denied from predominantly Black and Brown populations. And although we see a lot of issues that have been impacting Black and Brown communities, now impacting everybody across our country in terms of the cost of living, student loan debt, all different kinds of issues that have penetrated our different sectors that we are now living as a country and grappling with. How do we make amends, and how do we make sure that people have access to opportunities for wealth building and to home ownership? in the midst of the current day challenges that have come out of the history that we've been talking about through Wider Path Home Foundation. And so we're just really grateful that you're here with us, and we're really happy to bring you into Wider Path Home, and we'll keep letting you know different ways that you can get involved. I help run the Honoring Stories and Integrating Curriculum Community of Practice, and we'll be starting the next round in January, on January 6th. So we'll be inviting you to come get involved with the work of many here at Embrace that have contributed to building Wider Path Home Foundation, our down payment assistance parameters, and have built out the community development partnerships that we have with our local, in our target markets, with local community development corporations who have housing counselors, who have workforce development, who have all different wraparound services, healthcare, all different ways that they are working to replenish a village that has been grasping for air in our country, and in the ways that unequal treatment has played out over time. So we're just really grateful that you're here, and we're super excited to have Jeff join us. And Brian, I'm going to turn it back to you to introduce Jeff.
Thank you, Sarah. And I would just add, for some of I'm originally from Indiana and just outside of Indianapolis. One of the things is, if I've gone on my journey, is to research the history of Indianapolis, where I grew up. And so I would encourage each of you to go out. I mean, there's, we're fortunate enough to live in an age where we've got Google and the internet, and we can go out and easily search and find the stories that are out there. And I would just encourage each of you to do that in your own communities, whether it's where you were raised or where you currently live, and to kind of understand what is happening and what has happened. And so just, that's just my encouragement to you as avid learners in this space. And so I'll just introduce Jeff. Jeff is Reverend Jeff Wright. He's the CEO of Urban Ministries Incorporated. He also holds a JD from Georgetown, got an MBA from Columbia, and he spent before at UMI. He spent 20 years at Fortune 15 companies in business development. So he has some understanding of how to put things together and how to grow things. He has been a co-author of at least one book I know of, nonprofit leadership in a for-profit world. He's, serves with Urban Ministries, serves tens of thousands of African-American churches through publishing and media needs, and also through urban outreach, nonprofit, through the redevelopment of many communities. So Jeff, we really appreciate your time today, and we appreciate you sharing and educating us on the things that you are really passionate for you in and around this space. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Brian, for the introduction, and Sarah, thank you for the invitation. It's really my privilege to be here to join you and to share with you. Let me introduce myself by saying that I am married. I have a wonderful wife, Lakita, and we have 4 children. I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. My oldest son is 36 and works in an education tech company. I'm very proud of my oldest daughter, Amanda, who is a doctor. She's an internal medicine physician. And for all you parents out there, especially those of you with young children, the day can come when you can learn from your children. And I listen to my daughter all the time. I have another daughter, Natalie, who's a 29-year-old entrepreneur, and then I have a 15-year-old. I will take offers. No, Justin is the heart of my life. Right now, I live in 2 cities. UMI, the company I run, is based in Chicago. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., and that's where I am at this moment. And I'm in Washington, D.C. because my mother is 101 years old, and she is a librarian. She's a retired librarian. And when your mother is a librarian, you learn to read and respect books a lot. So when we were kids growing up here in Washington, D.C., and I grew up on Capitol Hill, we visited all of the monuments because they're all free. And I encourage everybody, come to Washington. It's our nation's capital, and the museums and the Smithsonian's are free. You don't have to pay. But my favorite museum, it's not really a museum, but my favorite of the many, many government buildings that we have here is the Archives building. It was built in 1934. And it's where we have the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all these incredible historic documents. And out front of that building are two statues that were designed by a man named Aiken. They're huge, they're 15 feet tall. And one of them is called Past, and it's a woman holding a volume, and it has an inscription at the base, and the inscription at the base of that statue says, "What is past is prologue. What is past is prologue." Now, over on the other side of the archives building, which is again where all of these historic documents are, is another statue called The Future. And it's a man, he's gazing off into the future. And his statue, by the same sculptor, architect, has a plaque on the front that says, "Study the past." So what is past is prologue, study the past. It's so important for us, for our subject today, to understand where we've come from as a nation, as communities, as individuals, and we must study the past. Most of us don't like history. We took maybe one class, celebrated when it was over, dates and names. But if we don't understand history, we will not understand what's going on in our country today. And this is not some screed I'm about to do on bashing the country or any of that. Nope, forget that. We live in a great country, everybody. And for most of us, we did not choose to be here. None of us did. In fact, most of us didn't choose where we were born, when we were born, what family we were born into, or what our gifts are. And I would tell you as a person of faith that the only person who chose where he was born and when he was born and what family he was born into was a guy who was born 2,021 years ago into the family of Abraham in a place called Bethlehem. Okay, we didn't get to choose. So where are we? We're in the richest country in the history of the world. We have 4.5% of the world's population, 330 million Americans, and we control directly or indirectly about half the planet's wealth. Wow. So whatever else we could say, each of us, no matter how dispossessed, how difficult situations are, we're in a place of privilege. So here's what I want to talk about in the brief moments that I have. I've been asked to talk about wealth inequality, and I'm going to review very briefly a new study that came out from the Federal Reserve just a month ago. It's great, and you can get it. It's called Wealth Inequality and the Racial Wealth Gap. So you won't have to hear from Jeff Wright on that. You can hear from the Federal Reserve. And then we're going to look at housing wealth. And housing wealth is a particular kind of wealth. It's not stocks, it's not bonds. It's, generally speaking, appreciated real estate or just real estate, which is the major store of wealth for most Americans. And there's an even newer study from the Urban Institute called "Why Do Households of Color Own Only a Quarter of the Nation's Housing Wealth when they compose a third of the nation's households?" And that came out this month, November of 21, from the Urban Institute. Why do households of color own only a quarter of the nation's housing wealth when they compose a third of the nation's household? Then I will talk a little bit about what we can do about increasing home ownership, some solutions to this wealth gap and this housing gap. And then the last thing I'm going to encourage you to do is read history. So let's jump in. First, the Fed study. So in this Fed study, October 22nd, 2021, wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap, they conclude that the average Black and Hispanic or Latino household earns about half as much as the average white household and own only about 15 to 20% of the net wealth of those households. In other words, white households hold approximately 90% of all the wealth in the country. And this is according to this Fed study, even though they only account for about 68% of total households. And the gap, by comparison, is that Black and Hispanic households only hold a little less than 3% of the nation's wealth. So wealth is disproportionately skewed toward white households. And if things were made equal, Black households would have 5 times the wealth that they currently have, and Hispanic households about 4 times as much. So there's a growth in this wealth gap, and it's quite significant. And there's a persistence in it that's due to a number of key factors: the amount of wealth that you start out with, the way wealth is accumulated, income, which is directly related to wealth. And let's just be clear, wealth is like that money you have just sitting in the bank. Income is what you earn. And I know all of you as loan officers and others in the real estate finance industry understand that difference between wealth and income. But if you have more wealth to begin with, if you make more income, then you get to accumulate more wealth, and those disparities increase. And then there's also a difference between white households and Black and brown households when it comes to saving rates. So they earn less, which limits their ability to save more. They started off with less. And then this one is pretty critical as well. Young minority households are less likely to receive intergenerational transfers from their parents. For most Americans, their wealth is a combination of appreciated real estate and intergenerational wealth transfers, mostly from insurance. And so there is a significant gap between white households and Black households. There's also some interesting things in this study from the Fed on just the kind of wealth that's held by different communities. Lower income communities, Black and brown communities, tend to have more depreciable assets like cars and few liquid financial assets. On the other hand, white households have home equity, they might have business wealth, they might have financial wealth, and they tend to gain increases in their their financial wealth from interest income and capital gains, which of course have the advantage of lower tax rates, which allows you to accumulate even more wealth. So in some, non-white households suffer more in financial crises, they do considerably worse. And then we've seen this other factor that has contributed significantly to these wealth disparities, and that is the actual decline of home ownership in Black households. And there's been a steady decline from 2005, just before the housing crisis, through 2015, but it's bottomed out. So we literally have lower levels of Black home ownership than we had in almost over 50 years. And this is detailed in excruciatingly detailed, typical Federal Reserve type reports, but I do recommend that because it is one of the most concise pronouncements on wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap in our community. They conclude white households had a much larger share of wealth in their population share, and Black and Hispanic households disproportionately concentrated at low or even negative net worth ranges. And of course, one of the most prevalent means of accruing wealth for minority households, which is home ownership, has become less common in recent years, which has allowed the Black wealth gap to increase. Bad news story. All right, let's quickly pivot to the Urban Institute study. Now, the Urban Institute, based here in Washington, D.C., is doing an incredible job accumulating data that all of us can benefit from on not just wealth disparities, but also the issues of housing wealth. And specifically, housing wealth is just that part of your wealth that comes from that asset that you own, your home. So here are their key findings. They have two that I think are of particular interest to us, and I just want to read them. White homeowners are more likely to be older, live in a detached single-family home, and have a home with more rooms, and all of these things contribute to higher home values. So white households just have houses that tend to be worth more because of those attributes. Their second key finding was even after controlling for household, property, and neighborhood characteristics, Black, Hispanic, and other non-white homeowners still have lower home values. And this reflects, in their view, a history of systemic racism, including the role of household wealth on home values, because there is definitely a correlation. And some of this data is really quite interesting, where you look at the values of homes by race in different communities, even where you adjust for the differences in percentage of households that own homes, homes owned by African American and Hispanic and other folks tend to be valued lower. So the gap is quite dramatic. So although there are like twice as many white households as there are households of color, white households hold nearly 3 times the value in terms of housing wealth. It's quite shocking, and I would encourage you to take a look at it, because it really paints a really clear picture of just some of these disparities in the values of people's home based on whether they are an African American or white homeowner. And some of the market differences are dramatic. In Houston, for example, the average value of a home owned by a white family is almost 4 times greater than the average value of a house owned by a Black or a brown family. And in this study done by the Urban Institute, you can look at your market, you can look at specific markets. One of the things that Sarah and I talked briefly about was the Washington, D.C. area, which has Prince George's County, which is very likely the richest county by household income in the African-American community nationally. And the gap in home values between Prince George's County, which is predominantly Black, affluent, middle-class county, and the home values in Montgomery County, another DC suburb, is dramatic. In one community, a home that might be $700,000, which is still a pretty high-end home, obviously, in Prince George's County, same house, move it over to Montgomery County, it's $1.5 million house. These are very interesting differences. Now, just moving to the broader numbers on home ownership, again, we have a treasure trove of just recent information. So the US Census in their 2020 census, which was just completed, reported that at the end of 2020, the rate of African-American home ownership is 44%, and that's a pretty low level. Whereas the rate of white home ownership is nearly 75%, 74.5%. So there's a really big gap between white home ownership and Black home ownership. And one of the interesting things about this gap is that it's not as big, but there is still a significant gap even at incomes above $100,000. So home ownership rates for African Americans who make $100,000 or more are still significantly lower than white households. And of course, for African Americans, a high income is less likely to result in high wealth than it might in a white company. So the racial wealth gap is dramatically higher than the racial income gap. So I might make the same amount of money or close to the same amount of money as, say, a white family comparable to mine, but they are still likely to have greater wealth, primarily because the value of their home would be greater. And actually, that would be true for me personally, even though I live in a home in suburban Chicago that's on almost 2 acres, and the value of my home might be $350,000 to $400,000. That same home, in fact, 2 acres anywhere in a metro area in this country is probably worth a lot more than that. But that's too personal. So how does this happen? What are some of the reasons that this came about? Well, we know our nation's history: segregation laws, restrictive covenants, sounds like you talked about those, racial steering, and redlining are 4 of the major clauses, but some of the ones that aren't talked about as much that are actively underway right now is banks are closing, even in affluent African-American neighborhoods, than at rates that are higher than in low-income non-African-American neighborhoods. A major money center bank, which will remain nameless, just closed a branch in my neighborhood, which is a 98% African-American homeowner community. I live in Olympia Fields, Illinois, if you want to go check that out. And Chase just closed their branch in our neighborhood. What the heck's going on? Of course, many people of color are living in credit deserts, places where they have little or no access to mainstream credit and may not even have a credit score. And then we have these market gaps. There's a knowledge gap. A lot of people think they've got to have perfect credit and 20% down to buy a home. And we know that that's not necessarily the case, but there is that knowledge gap. You've got huge trust issues. African Americans and people of color, brown people, often just don't trust the financial institutions and the lending institutions because of historic discrimination and the exploitation that they've, in many instances, experienced firsthand that have prevented them from obtaining affordable and sustainable mortgages. And we know that during the subprime event in our history, just a little over 10 years ago, that subprime mortgages were often given to Black and brown people, even when they didn't need them, when they qualified for more traditional. There's a huge market gap. This is a big deal where we are already in a tremendous lack of inventory and supply in the housing market generally. But in Black and brown communities where there is housing stock, it's often of poor quality. And poor quality homes, you know, sometimes it's a matter of disinvestment, racial redlining, discriminatory policies, but that is another depressor. And then we've already talked about the resource gap of lower wealth and lower income. There have been a number of solutions proposed. I want to mention a couple of them, and then I want to get to history. From the Urban Institute, you know, they've done, I'm so impressed with some of the work they've done. They've done quite a bit of research on potential solutions, some of which I think are at hand. And they've got a 5-point framework for addressing some of these problems of reducing the Black home ownership gap and the brown home ownership gap. And Urban Institute, go to their website, their 5-point framework for reducing the Black home ownership gap is quite detailed. I just want to give you the headlines. The first one, of course, is the idea of policy solutions and advancing local policies like micro mortgages and improving and investing in community development corporations and others, and looking at policies like property tax relief. These are things that can be effectively advocated in communities and can make a difference. The second point that they point out is just the whole issue of affordability. Can they tackle housing supply constraints and affordability? And there's a lot of work going on right now to encourage affordable housing stock. One of the things that I am personally very interested in is helping people to understand that affordable housing shouldn't just mean rental. We need to give people the opportunity to gain equity and to increase their wealth through home ownership, and not just an affordable place to live in a nice community, but that they rent and can never own. A third area in their 5-point framework is just looking at the financial system. And I know at Embrace, you guys are doing that, making equitable and accessible housing a financial system fix, whether it's down payment assistance programs or things of that nature. Their fourth pillar is education. And at UMI and Urban Outreach Foundation, we're trying to help in the education front. And then their fifth is the issue of sustainability and generational wealth transfer, just focusing on helping people understand the power of intergenerational wealth transfer, encouraging people to get insurance and do estate planning and doing these things that for many of us is it's just second nature. But for people who have not been exposed to that, it can be difficult. All right, I want to end with a history lesson. I want to encourage you, not so much with history that I'm going to give you, but I just want to refer you to some resources. There may be people who are interested in digging deeper. I know you've had some information presented in the past on redlining and other subjects, but I really encourage you to study the past because it's a long and a convoluted one, and there's some good resources. If you want to go way back, one of my favorite books is this one, The Color of Wealth. And in The Color of Wealth, you will get history in our nation's founding about how we went from a slave nation to a free nation, but what some of the costs were for enslaved people. So, for example, we just often assume that the Black community especially is this, intact community that just had bad decisions and families fall apart. Well, if you were an enslaved African American, in most instances, you couldn't be married. Families were broken up. And in The Color of Wealth, there's very interesting detail on how African American women, after the importation of slavery was banned in the United States, were then bred, separated from their families, and literally bred, often being raped by their owners or their owners' sons, to produce children who, in fact, were then born in slavery. So we didn't have Black families until 1865. And right after the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, the most prolific ad in newspapers all across the country were Black husbands and wives looking for their relatives. There are ads, there's hundreds of those. Then, as you move into the Reconstruction era, this book, recently done, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap by Mercer Badaran, who's Iranian, which is quite interesting. She's an Iranian immigrant. She details how we went from General Sherman's Field Order number 15, signed in March of 1865, which promised land to freed African-American slaves, was subverted by Andrew Johnson, who, the accidental president, he became president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and basically was a Southern sympathizer. He pardoned thousands and thousands of the people that in other countries we would call traitors, who tried to overthrow the United States and form the Confederate States of America, and undermined and reversed all of the work that was designed to provide resources for these newly freed enslaved people. Her study and telling of the story of the Freedmen's Bank will also impress you if you're interested in that Reconstruction era. But if you think about it, for the period of 1865 to 1905, when we had the largest period of church growth in American history, that's right, wasn't the First Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, it was 1865 to 1905, when 30 to 40,000 new churches were founded in America by freed African Americans. It produced not just an incredible resurgence of church growth in America, but also the development of over 100 historically Black towns. Not just that one that we were reading and hearing about earlier this year in Greenwood, Oklahoma. There were 100 Black towns, church-centered, intact communities that had all the things that it takes for a community to be a community and not just a neighborhood. A neighborhood is where you live. In a community, there are jobs, there's a circulation of dollars and so forth. And they were all over the country. Now, you probably heard about The Color of Law, this New York Times bestseller that gives great detail on government-sanctioned redlining as part of Federal Housing Administration. And of course, the persistence of this legally sanctioned discrimination continues to this day in the appraisal process. It's been consistently studied that appraisers reduce or value properties lower if they're in Black and brown communities. But this is a foundational text for that. And then there have been a number of studies on the multi-generational impacts of wealth disparities that come from just being Black in America. This one, The Hidden Cost of Being African American by Shapiro, is good. There's another, Black Wealth, White Wealth. Now, for people who don't want to read a whole bunch of statistical nonfiction, stuff like that, Matthew Desmond wrote a book a couple of years ago called Evicted. And he tracks 8 families. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning book. And he makes this real and just brings the stories of people trying to solve their housing and their financial issues. And I encourage you to read that, because that's kind of a page turner, but it is a living example of what the impact on actual human beings are from the kinds of issues that we're talking about. Listen, I could go on, and I would like to, but I have limited time. But I do want to encourage you to read the history, understand the facts. Don't just watch the videos or the various BCs who are on TV, whether it's N or A or MS or FOX. Read. We have to read because God wants us to lead as a nation in wealth and housing and justice so we can have his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. God bless and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was fantastic. And you know, I was a history major in college. You know, so you know, there's great books for us to go look at, and hopefully everybody's getting on their Amazon account right now and ordering books. And I think, you know, these are really important things for us to understand as people of influence within the housing finance industry. You know, these are just tremendous things, and we really appreciate your time. We appreciate your as we started to look at doing something with Dennis last year, and just your consulting to us and giving us your information. We really appreciate it. And yeah, just the time today was fantastic. Sarah, anything else?
I just want to say thank you, Jeff, so much. That was not easy to summarize that much information in a small amount of time, but thank you for putting the framework in place for us to understand how to move forward, and then putting some really good resources in our hands. And I just want to add to what you said, that one thing I like to say about our country is that the history and the system of slavery that was set in motion, that was at the founding and was built into every mechanism of our families and of our communities and of all the different sustainable resources that make up a community, that system never, it ended to a certain extent, the actual system of slavery, but it shifted forms, it changed forms, and it becomes in many ways more and more sophisticated and subtle, and takes a lot of reflection and understanding of the layers of how it plays out in our lives, because it wasn't just a system that enslaved African-American people. It was a system that enslaved white people to mindsets and to dynamics that worked against us and our families. I feel like I'm still overcoming that history in my family. And I see all the generations back and how it impacted my grandparents and my great-grandparents to be in a position that was basically built, and I'm stealing this from Carrie Finchman from our COP, that was built on exclusion, among other things. And so I think it's just really helpful to have that framing in place as we're thinking about reading this history, that this is our history, our American history, and it has impacted every single one of our families and every single one of our practices and every single one of our industries. And it takes a lot of really careful, reflective work to think about how we unwind it and get back to the family we were meant to be. You know, another thing that's just standing out to me is that there was so much that was built into the design to keep us apart. And one thing I have always felt growing up in St. Louis, where our, racial reconciliation was just not something that happened. We didn't have reparations. We didn't, not that it really happened well in our country anyway, but it really didn't happen well in St. Louis. And so one of the fallouts of that is that I grew up feeling like my family had been separated from me, and that I had been forced out of a family that very much was my family, and I feel is my family. And so all of the challenges that come from that were set in motion, that could have been so different if people had been given equality, if people had been given, and if we had recognized and reconciled from what had been set in motion, the kind of trajectories that would have been set in motion would have been very different. So thank you, Jeff, for setting us up for just phenomenal opportunities for conversation. I want to just point us to 3 framing questions. We're going to transition to Audley. And Brian, I'll let you introduce him, and then I'll say some introductory comments about Audley, because I can never say enough about Audley. Yeah. But I just also want us to orient towards 3 framing questions that we can be thinking with, because we're kind of move into the practical. We got the bigger picture of what's happened in our country and how the racial wealth gap has played out because of the redlining that took place and the racial restrictive covenants and urban renewal that continues to unfold, and all other kinds of forces in the housing world. But now we're going to go into just kind of like, what can we do about this, right? And really thinking on the more practical level, how do we start to develop the lenses that help us see in our day-to-day practices as loan officers, as housing industry professionals, how this redlining plays out in ways that we have to become fine-tuned to understand, so that we can be advocates and we can influence our industry partners and we can form more productive business partnerships and become a part of the change, and expand our markets and expand our influence in communities. So these are the three questions that we're thinking with. How do you see this history of housing inequalities influencing the housing industry today? So as you're listening to Audley and our conversation with Audley that's coming, this is a great question to keep in mind. And then where are there places at Embrace or with your business and community partners where you're already having a tremendous impact, or where you want to have more of an impact on the housing inequality trends that we're seeing for the better? And Embrace is on that journey, and Wider Path is a set of resources to support Embrace on that journey. So really exciting, two places that we can be thinking about where we can make that impact. And then also, what can we all keep doing to raise the number of loans provided to lower income families across our country and to Black and Brown communities? So as we transition to talking with Audley, those are three questions, and I'll put them in the chat as well, so you can kind of keep them at the forefront of your mind, and are good conversation starters when we finish our presentation today. Brian, would you like to introduce?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And just so everybody's aware, we obviously we track the numbers. I am a capital markets guy and a data person, and so just to we've increased our first-time home buyers in the Black and Brown community. From 463 in 2020 to 619, through early November here in 2021. Obviously, we got more work to do. And for those of you who are challenged with getting your GMI data, this is my compliance plug, where you can get GMI data. We love to see it, because blank or not applicable or not provided, leaves ambiguity. And so try to get that information. So the compliance team, I'll hopefully get a high five from you later today. With that, we'll go into Audley Lewis here. Audley is one of my favorite people to just talk with, and I've never actually met Audley in person in real life. It's only virtual here. At some point in time, I'm going to actually get down to Hampton Roads. But I love talking with Audley. I love texting with him. And he just has a love for people. Audley's, from a professional perspective, 33 years in sales and finance. He loves his wife. He loves his family. And, if you want to just talk forever, just ask him about his kids and his wife, and he will go on. And but he's just got a great relationship there. He's a tremendous man of faith who loves God, who loves Jesus, and as a result loves people. Audley spent a lot of time with first-time home buyers, and Audley has been on the journey with us with Wider Path from day one. He is one of our board members, and he's got a lot to share here about his thoughts and his experience as a man of color who has been in the finance business. And so with that, Audley, I'll hand it over to you and let you share what's on your heart today. And I can't wait to hear what you have.
Thank you, Brian, Sarah, Dr. Wright. They say to give honor where honor is due, so I do honor you on today. Thank you for sharing all that you've shared.
Hello, better looking.
I'm sorry, that was Siri speaking back. Yeah, all that you've shared today has been a great education for me, and I'm thankful for it. One of the things that stuck out basically was the fact that Black ownership is decreasing. And, sometimes, there's an old adage, that we can't see the forest for the trees. And basically it applies to me because in my sphere of influence, I'm seeing an increase in young African Americans coming to the table and attempting to purchase homes. But when you look at the national statistics, as you gave, there is a significant decrease. I believe you said the number was 40% decrease, and that's alarming. You know, one of the things that I've taken away from this, and I've also been pondering, is the fact that education is the key. You know, to handling credit, to having the courage to step into home ownership. Education is the key. Like you shared, that there was people that made over $100,000 that are not attempting to purchase homes. And it's because of lack of information. And we just recently had a conversation with one of my coworkers about that very thing, that we can learn a whole lot from the streets and from what we hear on the news and be disheartened and discouraged. And you being a reverend and all, I'm sure that you've heard people say, when I get myself together, I'm going to go to church, right? And in reality, what happens is that we go to church to get ourselves together. That should be the reality of what we do. But we find ourselves in a position where we're going to fix it, and then we're going to go see a loan officer, or we're going to attempt to do whatever. And don't get me wrong, that home ownership for anyone, I remember purchasing my first home at 22, and my mom was a real estate agent. And she began to talk to me about buying this home. And I was scared to death. The thought of committing for 30 years, and she actually put it in a package where I could understand. She said, basically, you're going to have to live somewhere, right? You're going to have to pay rent to someone. So you can pay someone else's mortgage, or you can give yourself an opportunity to not only have a place to live, but to build some equity so that you can have financial stability. And she gave me an out. She said, if you do purchase the home and it becomes too much for you, I'll take it off your hands. Well, 7 years later, I sold that home, and I sold it for over $100,000 more than I purchased it for. And that mom of mine, that when I was 15 or 16, that I thought was dumber than a box of rocks, became the most intelligent person to me when that transaction took place, believe it or not. But what I've experienced in our community and is basically, in general, that as a community of people, we're talking about Black and brown people, there's a failure to pass on information and educate one another in the areas of credit, budgeting, and actually acquiring wealth. And so our parents may be very good at doing it. They might have been very diligent at paying the bills and doing all the things that's necessary. But the simple step of saying, you know what, the most important thing you can do with your credit is pay your bill on time. And knowing that anytime you sign a contract or commit to a contract, you have committed your name and my name to something, that would have been a good piece. Because the most important thing to maintaining credit and to build your credit score is to pay your bill on time, to honor the commitments that you make. As Dr. Wright talked about, the disparity in property values in a Black community versus a white community with almost identical property sizes and types of homes is a reality. I know that in the real estate industry, there's something that's called specific performance. And it goes to the point that it says that no two homes are in the same location, even though they're identical, right? And because of the longitudinal and latitudinal position and the actual landscape of the property, it makes it specific. And so therefore, someone committed to sell your property and change their minds for no apparent reason, you could probably go after them for that one thing and probably get compensated or even take the property from the individual. That's specific performance. And so as we look at specific performance as it pertains to values, yes, there is something wrong. There's a disparity there. And we talked about that, and Dr. Wright brought that up as far as the appraisal values. Redlining is something that has been and still is a part of our society, even if it is subversive. But I know that there are friends of mine that I know and people that I've come in contact with that were selling homes that, basically said, in order for me to get someone to purchase my home, and realtors are actually telling them this, off the walls, and any paraphernalia that may relate to you being a person of color. And that may yield you a better yield and even cause your property to be sold sooner. And the other thing about it is that we have appraisers that's out here and they're lowballing properties in Black communities. And I am witness to it and have experienced it, especially in the booming refinance market. You'll see that what should be and even what the guideline says as far as property values, and people use Zillow, which is now defunct, kind of, as a gauge on what a property should be worth, or talking to realtor partners and saying, hey, what do you think this property, can you do a market analysis on this property? And for some reason, when the properties are appraised, they come in significantly lower. The other thing that I've noticed as well is the exception for appraisals on exceptions for appraisals on refis as it pertains to the Black and brown community. I don't know if that's something that's built in, but I've seen it more often than I have not. And so that's a cause for concern. There's a significant gap in the taxes that's paid, usually in the Black and brown community. I remember growing up in Roosevelt, Long Island, and at one point, this is in Nassau County, Roosevelt is 1 square mile and paid the highest taxes per capita in Long Island, and had the least amount of services, the worst educational resources that you could possibly imagine. The library was pretty much a small 1-story house with a basement. So, and you paid real estate tax, plus you had to pay school tax there. And when you sum that up, I remember that particular house I owned, I paid over $6,000 for a very inexpensive home. It was $36,000 I bought the home for. And I paid $6,000 a year for this home. And like I said, the resources weren't there. Going to the school board meetings and the arguments that would flare up over that, getting resources to the schools, it was diverted to the current political climate and whatever was going on at the helm in Nassau County. So I have, witnessed that firsthand. The other thing that I've seen in our communities is the lack of resources for special education. Black and brown kids are labeled as trouble really quickly in the education process. We're talking about by the time they are 2nd or 3rd grade, they've actually decided whether or not this person is going to function within our society and how many jails to build. And when you have students that have dyslexia as well as ADHD, that's not being diagnosed or properly handled. You have Ritalin, that's something that's prevalent in the school systems. You have a system that's set up to cause people to fail. And so therefore, it perpetuates the school to prison pipeline. And so if that's in place, then what you're getting ready to do is, as families are built, they're destroyed, because as we all know, the prison population versus the actual Black population is excessive. And so, yeah, we deal with systemic racism on a large scale nationwide. Excuse me.
They were down
I
to
pride
about
myself.
That's okay. Just one more minute. Thanks.
Okay. I pride myself in, being an advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves behind the walls of corporate America. When I was in the car business, they said that they heard from me, the banks did, more than any other GM in the nation. And I would always take someone's story and tell it to the bank to try to advocate for them to help them get along. And it's the same thing here in the mortgage industry, taking a second look. I find that there are some lenders that are my number one suppliers of deals because they fail to actually look at the client. They kind of assess whether or not they want to take a look at the client based on demographics. And I wind up with the client, and oftentimes what they've told the client has nothing to do with the loan whatsoever. It oftentimes takes me less than 20 minutes to get them a pre-approval out. So that's kind of discouraging and disheartening as we go forth.
All right, Audley, I got a question for you. I was gonna ask you another question, but you answered it for me. I've seen you in action, and obviously we've had a lot of conversations. But you built your business on caring for people and going that extra effort, which in some cases is just effort that should be put out that isn't put out for people. And we really appreciate you, here at Embrace and in Wider Path. But my kind of final question is going to be to you is, what is it that made you want to jump on board and to help us with this effort with the foundation? What was that one thing or a couple of things? If you could just kind of share your heart there, I'd appreciate it.
Truth be told, when I was approached, my response to Dennis Hardiman, as well as others that had approached me about this, was I didn't see what I had to offer. But reluctantly, I showed up. And hearing Dennis's heart as he was impacted by the George Floyd's killing, and identifying where he had been doing business as usual and wanted to do something different. And the proposal was made basically, what can we do? And I thought of the song that I play for my grandson. He loves Michael Jackson, The Man in the Mirror. And I identified with it. As I was trying to back out of being a part, that song played in my head. I'm looking at the man in the mirror, and I'm asking him to change his ways. And no message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change. So Dennis caused me to look at myself, and my response to him is if I was going to be a part of this, it had to not only impact me as an individual, but the communities that I serve and the nation that Embrace serves. And he was, open to listen to this. And basically out of that, as we've seen, affordable housing showed up, I think December 23rd. It's going on a year old. And in my book of business, I think I'm about 25 to 30% penetration there. And it's been a great resource, for the clients that I serve. The other portion of it is the education piece that has been spoken about. And basically I stumbled into that doing the VHDA classes. And it has been a blessing to me to help people to understand what it entails to become a homeowner, but also what it entails to keep a home, to maintain one. And so for those reasons, as well as other things coming forth, I'm excited about being here at Embrace Home Loans and also being a part of Wider Path.
Thank you very much, Audley. We really appreciate you. And I appreciate you sharing your heart, and I appreciate you for being my friend in the work that is all being done here through both Embrace and through Wider Path. So I'm going to hand it off to Sarah and let you kind of close us out. Sarah, I know you have some words, and let you take it over.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Audley, thank you so much for your comments and for putting it in context in terms of personalizing it in our industry and what you're seeing and how a tax base that gets depleted from home values that have been undervalued. And in the COP, we really go into the history of restrictive covenants and redlining and how that has impacted the available homes for African-American communities. There was a time in our history when all the homes were pretty much allocated to white people with mortgages and subsidized lending and everything that they needed to be able to get into home ownership, but the investment was in public education or in public housing for Black and Brown communities. And that trajectory has been set in motion in a way that has perpetuated the inequalities that you're speaking to and all the other resources that come with housing, because education is tied to property taxes and because so many of our other public services are tied to our property taxes. And if we don't have that tax base, then we are constantly depleting what communities have access to. And then when you bring in other systemic factors that factor into just the comprehensive approach to inequalities that we have set in motion in our country. Basically, there are way more layers to the issues that we're talking about in every single sector, in every single industry, in every single school, and in every single system. Just a really sobering statistic. And I don't have the actual statistic. This was quoted from a friend of mine that I was talking to over the weekend. But he said in the St. Louis public schools, something around 50% of the students are homeless. That's how I got involved in housing. I'm an educator, but 50% of the students are homeless. They do not have a stable home that they are going home to. And the school system itself is struggling to be able to connect with the parents and the families of the students because of that homelessness. So there's huge ramifications of this history that we're talking about. And for me, it's just a total delight to see Embrace stepping in and Wider Path stepping in and really thinking strategically about how we can bring together the housing sector to not just only address these issues in housing, but they have huge ripple effects in all of the other sectors that we're a part of when we tackle what's at the center of the equation, which is housing. So I just really want to say thank you to everybody who is here, and we will have the recording and we'll put it out so you can watch it again. And if you would like to get involved in this work, one of the things I just want to end on is this note of collective action. Dr. Wright has spoken to the history of inequalities as they were set in motion. But as those inequalities were being set in motion, collective action was taking hold. And there in no way, shape, or form has any African-American, Black, Brown, low income, white community, anybody ever in this country ever just been like, all right, you can just take my land, you can take my homes, you can take everything, you can have it all, I'm good. No, people have fought back, and they have fought back with strategy, and they have fought back with love, and they have fought back with grace, and they have fought back with innovation and with creativity, and they have done the most amazing things. And it's across race, right? It's across communities. It's everybody stepping up to do their part. And what I love about Embrace is that there are so many people who just keep stepping up to say, what can I do? What can I do? How can I do? How can I serve from my role, from my position? We have started last year. We had the first Honoring Stories COP. It went for a whole year. They're still going. People still meet every Tuesday with me. They still have more ideas for how we can make change in our company. And we're talking about what does it look like to set some systems in place where we can really track with first-time home buyers, and we can make sure we're getting the right educational resources to them at the right places in the right times and in the right ways to bring them into the arena of homeownership. And as Audley, you said, and this is true for all communities, there's an information gap. How do we make sure we get the right information to the right people at the right times to help them keep moving towards homeownership? That's an initiative that's underway. We're thinking about our community partners, cataloging all different kinds of community development corporations so that our loan officers can say, you know what, you may not be ready for homeownership, but here's a housing counselor that you can connect with. And then when you're ready, come back to me so that we have the resources in place to provide the education and the knowledge and the partnerships that can help people keep moving forward. But we want to just keep expanding all of our pipelines and our impact in communities, and to think very strategically about how we just keep growing our business networks and how we tap into all that Embrace is doing is in locating itself and its retail branches in places like Prince George County. I don't know if that's where we're going, don't quote me on that, but in places like DC, where we have predominantly lower income communities and Black and brown communities, where we can make a big impact. That's where Embrace is going, and that's where we get to go as a company with Embrace. And if you want to know how to do your part and learn more about how to access the resources that we're cultivating for Wider Path, come join our COP. We're in our second iteration right now. We're running 8-week stints of this, and you can start our third iteration in January, and I put the sign up in the link. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you everybody who has stepped up time and time again to say, how can I help? How can I help? There are so many people, I can't even name them all, but we have so many people like Audley who are in communities, who are partnering with community development corporations. Jeff Nelson, just putting a plug out to him, stay tuned with him. He's got all kinds of first-time homebuyer workshops that are happening and ways that we can join him and support in getting the word out to the communities that we have access to. Many other people like Jeff and Audley who are doing great work in our company that we can support and back and think strategically about how we join them in the community development work that they're doing. So thank you again so much for being here. And Jeff, thank you so much. Dr. Wright, thank you so much. Reverend Wright, thank you so much for everything you're doing in communities and for helping us set so much of this in motion from the very beginning of all of this work. And then coming full circle to say, you know, to keep us moving on the path. So.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Reverend Wright. Thank you, Audley. Thank you, Sarah. You know, just to everyone, just keep doing what's that one thing that you can do next to help make one more homeowner, one more community, not just a neighborhood. I love that the Reverend Wright. It's not about a neighborhood; it's about communities. And let's make, you know, happy, healthy communities that are prospering. So with that, thank you, everybody, and you know, look forward. You know, next month we'll have another one of these, and look forward to the invitations coming out. So everyone, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.